The first thing you want to do when you're creating a pivot is to understand your data. You should always know what it is that you're working with. I can tell you it's basically a little sample customer data set from a store like Staples. So we've got products that are being sold from like office supplies and furniture to various customers. There are order dates associated with those sales. Those customers live in particular areas of the country. Those areas are grouped by region. And then we have information about each sale, which also includes a profit ratio. Okay, so this is some upfront due diligence you would want to make on your data set before you even think about a pivot table. Now let's look at how we actually create the pivot table. The first thing we want to do is we want to grab all of our data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click in the upper leftmost cell, that's cell A1 in this example, and I want to grab all the data quickly. So I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to scroll with my mouse and try and just, wait while the spreadsheet sort of scrolls down. That's going to take way too long, and I simply don't want to use my time that way. I want to be very quick. So I'm going to use my hotkeys instead. I'm going to click into cell A1, and then I'm going to do Shift key and then Command on the Mac or Control on a Windows computer, and then I'm going to use those arrow keys. Arrow key to the right, arrow key down, and I've just immediately selected all of my data, which you can see is now highlighted yellow. And this is what I need for my pivot. So now I'm going to go to Insert, Pivot Table. So it's right there, Insert Pivot Table. And I'm given a dialog box. Excel will allow me to select my data or make any changes. I'm good with what I've selected, so I'm going to leave this top option alone. And then it's going to give me the option to put the pivot into a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. I'll say New. And all of a sudden I've got a new worksheet. So I'm going to copy in an image that I want my students to look at. This is the pivot table that I want you to create. Okay, now let's see how this pivot table works. Well, I've got this thing over here that says pivot table 3, and I have this small instruction, click in this area to work with the pivot table. Okay, I'll do that. And look at what happens. I have now on the right a pivot table fields menu, and I also have up here in the menu bar pivot table analyze and design. So I'm being given immediately some access to some options to make this pivot table. The report I need to create, and let's imagine this is for a client or a supervisor, is I want to find all sales within the East region, and by month, I want to grab an average profit ratio for those sales, okay? So what I'd want to do is I'd want to come into my field name list, and I'd want to start to grab the fields that I need. I'm going to click on order date, I'm going to click on region, and I'm going to click on profit ratio. Okay, so what Excel immediately does is it drops these fields into the values quadrant. Now it's very important to note, we can actually move these fields around. What Excel is going to do is it's going to take a stab, a little bit of a guess at what you might need, and it's going to drop the fields into one of these quadrants, and it may or may not make sense. The critical thinking here is to understand how to lay the data out. So have a little bit of fun with this. Just see what it looks like. How does your view change? And you can see as I'm doing this that I'm getting updates on the screen based on what I'm doing over here on the right. So now what I want to do is I want to focus in on here, and let's just think about the way the data is arranged. So the values quadrant is where we're going to put the data that we want to measure. Now the measure here is the average of the profit ratio. And then for each average, I want to show the date. Let's take our order date and drop it into row. And you can see now I'm starting to get a little bit more of what I need. I have now by date, I have a count of the region and also the count of the profit ratio. Now, the region is actually a filter. I want to make the region a filter, and that's where the region goes, by filter. And now I have this option over here. I'm going to leave this unfilter for a moment. We'll come back to this in a second. Okay, so now I've got an issue here, which is that I have way too many rows given what I'm aiming for. This is a pivot table. I want to have a summary. Presenting a report where we're showing profit ratio by date, this is actually too detailed, and this is not going to have as much usefulness to an end user. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click in this column, and I get all of these options. I'm going to choose group, and then I'm going to choose months. And Excel does this immediately for us. Now you can use the right click, that's my handy go-to option, but you can also come up here, click Pivot Table Analyze, and choose Group Selection, and then you can choose Group Field, and choose months. So you can get to the same place through various options. The right click is just a much quicker shortcut, so that's why I tend to do that. Now I'm still not where I need to be because I have my months, but my average ratios don't look right. And I want to also note something. Notice how when I click out of the pivot table, I'm losing my pivot table field option. All I need to do is click back into the pivot table and I get those options back. And if you ever lose your pivot table list such that you do click in and you don't see it, you can come up here to field list and it'll just show it, okay? So this also will toggle it on and off. All right, let's look at how I can turn this count of profit ratio into an average. What Excel is doing is it's going into my data set and it's counting every instance of a profit ratio in the month of January, and it's getting 155 data points. 107 data points for February, and so on. Well, I'm not interested in that. I don't want to know the number of profit ratios. I actually wanted to measure the average. So I'm going to click on my little eye icon down here, and instead of count, I'm going to choose average. So now Excel is getting a little bit more where I need it to be. But a couple things going on here. Number one, this data looks kind of ugly. I want it formatted nicely. I'm going to do a nice percentage. That's much easier to read. And finally, I've got a div error in here. Well, that suggests that I've got some maybe null data in June, so Excel cannot compute an average in June. We're not going to dig too far into this only because I know also that I don't need all of this data. I only need East region data. So I'm going to go ahead and select East, and this is my final report. And I should note, you can update these headers. And so you have lots of options here. What we'll do in the next video is show how we can create a chart, a pivot chart off of this pivot table.